Thomas Hartwell clutched the worn photograph in his calloused hands, watching the afternoon train pull into the dusty Colorado Territory station. The year was 1887, and he was about to meet the woman who would save his dying ranch. Or so he hoped. The photograph showed a delicate young lady with fine features and a tiny waist. She would bring him 500 acres of swampland as her dowry, land that everyone said was worthless. What Thomas didn't know was that the woman stepping off that train would make him the richest man in 3 counties, but not in any way he could imagine. The train wheezed to a stop, steam hissing from its iron belly. Thomas straightened his best shirt and ran a hand through his dark hair. At 32, he was desperate. 3 years of drought had turned his once green pastures into cracked earth. His cattle were dying, and the bank was threatening foreclosure in just 30 days. This mail-order marriage was his last hope. The woman's letter had promised not just companionship, but land that came with water rights. Even if the swampland was useless, those water rights might save him. Passengers began stepping down from the train cars. Thomas watched each woman carefully, comparing them to the photograph. An elderly lady in black, a young mother with 2 children, a well-dressed woman who was quickly embraced by a waiting man. Then he saw her. The woman walking toward him looked nothing like the photograph. Nothing at all. Where the picture showed a slender figure, this woman was significantly larger. Her dress, while clean and well-made, strained around her fuller form. But there was something in the way she carried herself that made Thomas pause. Her back was straight, her head held high. She walked with confidence, not shame. Her eyes, when they met his, were intelligent and kind. Mr. Hartwell, her voice was educated, refined, not the timid whisper he'd expected from a desperate mail-order bride. Thomas swallowed hard, looking down at the photograph again, then back at her face. The features were similar, but everything else was completely different. "Are you Margaret O'Brien?" "I am." She set down her single carpet bag and extended a gloved hand. "I believe we have business to discuss." Business. That's what this was, Thomas reminded himself. A business arrangement. He shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "Miss O'Brien, welcome to Colorado Territory." Margaret's eyes swept over the dying landscape visible from the train platform, where most people saw only brown grass and dust. She seemed to be studying something else entirely. She pulled out a small notebook and made a quick sketch, then looked back at Thomas. "The drought has been severe," she observed, tucking the notebook away. "But I noticed the cottonwoods along that creek bed are still green. That's a good sign." Thomas blinked. Most women would have complained about the heat or the dust. This one was analyzing water tables. "You know about farming?" "I know about land." Margaret picked up her bag. "My father was a geologist back in Pennsylvania. I learned to read the earth the way other girls learned to read poetry." As they walked toward his wagon, Thomas struggled with his disappointment and confusion. This woman was not what he'd expected, but she was here, and he needed that land. The marriage contract was clear. Wedding tomorrow. Land deed transferred immediately after. He could go through with it. He had to go through with it. "The land you're bringing to the marriage," Thomas said as he helped her into the wagon. "The 500 acres. I should tell you, folks around here say it's worthless. Nothing but swamp and rocky ground." Margaret smiled, a mysterious expression that made Thomas wonder what she was thinking. "People often don't recognize value when they see it, Mr. Hartwell. That swampland has been in my family for 10 years. We've been waiting for the right time, the right person to develop it properly." The wagon ride to his ranch took 30 minutes. During that time, Margaret asked questions that surprised him. How deep were his wells? What was the mineral content of his soil? Had he noticed any changes in the underground spring patterns? These weren't typical questions from a bride-to-be. These were the questions of someone who understood geology. When they reached his ranch, Thomas felt embarrassed by its rundown appearance. The barn needed repairs, the fences were falling down, and the few remaining cattle looked thin and unhealthy. But Margaret didn't seem disappointed. Instead, she stood in his dusty yard and slowly turned in a complete circle, as if memorizing every detail of the landscape. "The bone structure is good," she said finally. "Excuse me, the land. Under all this drought damage, the bone structure is excellent. Good drainage patterns, solid foundation rock, and I suspect your water table is much better than it appears." She pointed toward a small rise behind his house. "That hill there, have you ever explored it? Just for firewood. Nothing up there but rocks and scrub brush." Margaret nodded, making another note in her little book. "We'll see about that." That evening, as Margaret settled into the small spare room that would be hers until after the wedding, Thomas sat on his porch wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The woman was clearly educated and intelligent, but she looked nothing like her photograph. Tomorrow they would marry, and he would gain the land he desperately needed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret O'Brien had her own plans she hadn't shared with him. Through the window, he could see her lamplight as she worked at the small desk, writing in what looked like a journal. What was she documenting so carefully? And why did she seem so confident about land that everyone else considered worthless? As Thomas drifted off to sleep that night, Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "You have no idea what you've actually gained today." But what did that mean? And why, when she'd said it, had she been looking not at him, but at the distant swampland that would soon be part of his property? The wedding took place the next morning in the small wooden church that served 3 neighboring towns. Thomas wore his only good suit, dark wool that made him sweat in the Colorado heat. Margaret appeared in a simple blue dress that, while well-made, couldn't hide her fuller figure. The ceremony was attended by barely a dozen people, mostly Thomas's neighbors who came more out of curiosity than celebration. Reverend Mitchell performed the brief service while the congregation whispered among themselves. Thomas caught fragments of their conversations. "Can't believe he went through with it. She's nothing like that picture he showed around. Desperate times, I suppose." The word stung, but Thomas kept his face neutral. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. He needed the land, and Margaret needed a husband. It was practical. When a reverend pronounced them man and wife, Margaret looked directly into Thomas's eyes. There was no romance in the moment, but there was something else. Understanding, perhaps, or determination. Thomas couldn't quite read her expression, but made him feel less alone in this strange arrangement. After the ceremony, they signed the papers that made the marriage legal and transferred the swampland deed to Thomas. As he signed his name, he noticed Margaret watching him carefully, as if this moment was more significant than just a legal formality. The deed described 500 acres of marsh and low-lying ground with associated water rights. It didn't sound like much, but it was his now. The ride home was quiet. When they reached the ranch, Thomas showed Margaret around the property, explaining his plans to somehow save the dying cattle and pay off the bank loan. Margaret listened without comment, but he noticed she kept looking toward the distant swampland, now technically part of their combined property. That evening, Thomas made his sleeping arrangements clear. "I've prepared the spare room for you," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I thought, given the circumstances of our arrangement, separate bedrooms would be appropriate." Margaret nodded calmly. "That's very considerate, Thomas. I appreciate your respect for my comfort." Her easy acceptance of the situation somehow made Thomas feel worse about the whole arrangement. Had she expected him to reject her based on her appearance? The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Over the next few days, Margaret settled into the household routine with surprising efficiency. She reorganized the kitchen, cleaned the house thoroughly, and began keeping detailed records of everything. Thomas found notebooks filled with her neat handwriting documenting his cattle numbers, feed supplies, and financial obligations. She had a systematic mind that impressed him, even as it puzzled him. But it was Margaret's early morning activities that really caught his attention. Every day before dawn, she would slip out of the house with a small bag of surveying tools. Thomas watched from his bedroom window as she walked across the fields toward the swampland. She would spend hours there, taking measurements, making sketches, and collecting soil samples. When she returned, she would work at the kitchen table with maps and charts that she kept carefully hidden when he approached. "What exactly are you doing out there?" Thomas finally asked one morning as she prepared to leave. Margaret paused at the door, her surveying bag in hand. "Research. I want to understand our land better." "Our land? Well, it's all connected now, isn't it? Your ranch, the swampland. Water doesn't recognize property lines, Thomas. Neither do soil conditions or geological formations." Before he could ask what she meant by that, she was gone, walking with purpose toward the marshy ground that everyone said was worthless. Thomas's friends didn't let him forget about his unusual marriage. When he went to town for supplies, he endured their comments and poorly hidden laughter. "How's married life treating you, Tom?" That bride sure was different from her picture. Maybe you should have asked for references along with that photograph. The worst was his neighbor Jake Burton, who owned the land adjacent to Thomas's ranch. Jake had been trying to buy Thomas's property for years, hoping to expand his own spread. Now he seemed to take personal pleasure in Thomas's situation. "You know, Tom, it's not too late to get an annulment," Jake said one afternoon as they repaired fence line between their properties. "Marriage hasn't been consummated, has it? Court would probably understand, given the deception with that photograph." Thomas's hands tightened on the fence wire. Margaret didn't deceive anyone. She just looked different than expected. "Different?" Jake laughed harshly. "That's one way to put it. Look, I'm trying to help you here. You made a mistake. Fix it before it gets worse. Take the land, get rid of the wife, and sell the whole thing to me. I'll give you enough to pay off your debts and start fresh somewhere else." The suggestion made sense from a purely practical standpoint. Thomas could keep the swampland, annul the marriage, and solve his financial problems. But something about Jake's eagerness to buy the property bothered him, and something about the way Jake talked about Margaret made his jaw clench with anger. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her mysterious research. Thomas began to notice changes around the property that he couldn't explain. Small stakes appeared in various locations, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Channels were scratched into the ground in patterns that seemed random but somehow purposeful. And Margaret's notebooks multiplied, filled with calculations and diagrams that looked more like engineering plans than household accounts. The financial pressure continued to mount. The bank sent another notice. 30 days had become 20, then 15. Thomas's cattle were dying faster than he could sell them. His neighbors shook their heads with pity when they saw him in town. The general consensus seemed to be that Thomas Hartwell was a man who had made one bad decision too many. But Margaret seemed unworried by their desperate situation. In fact, she seemed increasingly confident, almost excited. She spent longer hours at the swampland and filled more pages in her notebooks. When Thomas tried to discuss their financial problems with her, she would simply say, "Trust me, Thomas, everything is going to work out." One evening, as Thomas sat on the porch wondering how he would tell Margaret they might lose everything, she joined him with a cup of coffee and a thick folder of papers. "Thomas," she said, settling into the chair beside him, "I think it's time we talked about our real situation." She spread out detailed maps and geological surveys across the small porch table. The papers were covered with measurements, calculations, and technical drawings that looked like they belonged in an engineer's office, not on a failing ranch. "The swampland isn't worthless," Margaret said quietly. "In fact, it's the most valuable piece of property in this entire county. And I can prove it." Margaret spread the geological surveys across the porch table, her finger tracing lines that meant nothing to Thomas, but everything to her. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of blue marks on a detailed map. "These are underground spring systems. They run directly under our swampland and connect to a massive aquifer that extends for miles." Thomas leaned closer, squinting at the technical drawings. "I don't understand." Everyone says that land is just marsh and rocks. Everyone is wrong. Margaret's voice carried a quiet confidence that Thomas had never heard from anyone, especially not about his property. My father taught me to read geological surveys when I was 12 years old. This swampland sits on top of one of the largest underground water systems in Colorado. The springs feed into natural channels that could irrigate thousands of acres if properly managed. She pulled out another map, this one covered with her own handwriting and calculations. For the past 2 weeks, I've been measuring flow rates, testing water quality, and mapping the natural drainage patterns. Thomas, we could channel this water system to save not just your ranch, but every farm in this valley. Thomas stared at the papers, trying to process what she was telling him. You're saying this worthless swampland could provide water for irrigation? Not could, will. Margaret stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out toward the land in question. But it will require work. Hard, physical work. We'll need to clear channels, build control gates, and create a distribution system. It won't be easy, and it won't be cheap. Thomas felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. But alongside the hope came doubt. Even if you're right about the water, we don't have money for materials or labor. The bank is going to foreclose in 2 weeks. Margaret turned back to him with that mysterious smile he was beginning to recognize. Thomas, how much do you think farmers would pay for guaranteed water during a drought? I don't know. A lot, I suppose. But enough to cover our bank debt and fund a construction project. I've already spoken with 3 neighboring ranchers who are desperate for water. They're willing to pay in advance for water rights, even before we build the system. Thomas's head was spinning. His quiet, mysterious wife had apparently been conducting business negotiations while he thought she was just wandering around the swamp. You spoke to our neighbors without telling me. I spoke to desperate people who need what we can provide. That's different from making commitments on your behalf. Margaret sat back down and pulled out another notebook, this one filled with names and numbers. But Thomas, this will only work if we do it together. I have the knowledge, but I need your help with the physical labor and your credibility with the local community. The idea was overwhelming, but Thomas found himself starting to believe it might actually work. For the first time since the drought began, he could see a path forward that didn't end with losing everything. What do we need to do? First, we start tomorrow. We'll need shovels, picks, and lumber for channel walls. We'll work the early morning hours when it's coolest, and we'll start with the main channel that connects the largest spring to your cattle pasture. The next morning, Margaret appeared at dawn wearing men's work clothes that she had somehow acquired. Her dress was replaced by practical pants and a sturdy shirt, and her hair was tied back under a wide-brimmed hat. She looked ready for serious labor, despite her size making the work more challenging. Thomas had to admire her determination as they walked to the swampland. Margaret moved with purpose, pointing out where each channel should go and explaining how the water flow would work. Her earlier surveys had been incredibly detailed. She knew exactly where every spring was located and how to connect them efficiently. The work was backbreaking. They spent hours digging channels through rocky soil, building wooden gates to control water flow, and clearing debris from natural waterways. Margaret worked as hard as Thomas, though the physical labor clearly exhausted her more quickly. But she never complained, and she never suggested they should quit. By the 3rd day, their hard work began to show results. Water started flowing through the first channel toward Thomas's dying pasture. It was muddy at first, but as the system settled, the water ran clear and strong. Thomas watched in amazement as the first green shoots of grass appeared in areas that had been brown and dead for months. Word spread quickly through the valley. Neighbors who had been mocking Thomas's marriage arrangement suddenly appeared at his fence line, asking questions about the water system. Some offered to help with the labor in exchange for access to the water. Others wanted to hire Margaret to design similar systems for their own properties. But not everyone was pleased with their success. Jake Burton rode over on the 4th day. his face dark with anger as he surveyed the water flowing across Thomas's land. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded, pointing at the irrigation channels. Thomas straightened up from his work, shovel still in hand. "Saving my ranch. Same thing any man would do. That water has been flowing naturally for decades. You can't just redirect it to benefit only your property." Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Actually, Jake, we can. The water originates on our land, from springs located entirely within our property boundaries. We have every legal right to manage it as we see fit." Jake's face reddened. "Legal right or not, you're taking water that my cattle have been drinking from that creek for years." "The creek will continue to flow," Margaret replied patiently. "Our system actually increases the overall water flow by tapping directly into the underground source. There will be more water available for everyone, not less." But Jake wasn't listening to reason. Thomas could see the jealousy and frustration in his neighbor's eyes. For years, Jake had been the most successful rancher in the area, and he wasn't handling the idea that Thomas might surpass him. "This isn't over," Jake warned, wheeling his horse around. "Mark my words, you'll regret stirring up trouble." That night, Thomas and Margaret were awakened by strange sound from outside. They rushed to the window and saw dark figures moving around their irrigation channels. By the time Thomas got dressed and outside with his rifle, the intruders were gone. But the damage was obvious. Someone had destroyed 2 of their water gates and filled a section of the main channel with rocks and debris. Margaret stood in her nightgown and robe, surveying the sabotage with anger blazing in her eyes. "Whoever did this doesn't understand what they're dealing with," she said quietly. Thomas looked at his wife, really looked at her for perhaps the first time since their wedding. Here was a woman who had traveled across the country to marry a stranger, who had worked alongside him in backbreaking labor, who had designed an engineering solution that could save his ranch. And now someone was trying to destroy their work. "We'll rebuild it," Thomas said firmly. "And this time, we'll build it stronger." Margaret smiled at him, and for the first time, Thomas felt like they were truly partners. "Yes," she agreed, "we will. But first, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again." The rebuilding took 2 full days. Thomas and Margaret worked from sunrise to sunset, creating stronger channels and installing better water gates. This time, they built the system to be vandal-proof, using heavier lumber and deeper foundations. Margaret's engineering skills showed in every improvement, making the new system more efficient than the original design. It was on the second day, while digging a deeper channel to connect 2 spring sources, that Margaret's shovel struck something unusual. She bent down and examined the black substance coating the metal blade, then looked up at Thomas with excitement dancing in her eyes. "Thomas, come here quickly. Look at this." Thomas dropped his own shovel and hurried over. Margaret had scooped up a handful of dark, sticky material from the hole they'd been digging. It had a strong, distinctive smell that Thomas didn't recognize, but Margaret clearly did. "This is oil seepage," she said, barely containing her enthusiasm. "There's petroleum under our land." Thomas stared at the black substance coating Margaret's hands. "You mean like the oil they use for lamps?" "Not just lamp oil, industrial oil, the kind that railroad companies and mining operations pay top dollar for." Margaret wiped her hands on an old rag, but her eyes remained fixed on the hole. "Thomas, if there's as much oil down there as the seepage suggests, we could be looking at a fortune that makes our water system seem small by comparison." They spent the rest of the day carefully exploring the area around the oil seepage. Margaret used her geological knowledge to identify other signs that Thomas would never have noticed. Certain types of rock formations, specific soil discoloration, even the way some plants grew differently in particular spots. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. There was a significant oil deposit beneath their property. "We need professional confirmation," Margaret said that evening as they planned their next steps. "I know the signs, but we need a certified geologist to survey the land and give us official documentation of what's here." Thomas worried about the cost of bringing in an expert, but Margaret assured him it was a necessary investment. She wrote letters to 2 geological survey companies in Denver requesting immediate consultation. Within a week, a professional geologist named Samuel Hayes arrived to examine their property. Hayes spent 3 days conducting detailed surveys, taking soil samples, and studying Margaret's careful documentation of the site. His final report confirmed what Margaret had suspected. They were sitting on top of one of the largest oil deposits ever discovered in Colorado territory. This could yield hundreds of thousands of barrels, Hayes told them as he packed up his equipment. Maybe more. The geological formation suggests the oil field extends well beyond your current property boundaries, but the main deposit appears to be centered right here on your land. The confirmation filled Thomas with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This discovery could solve all their financial problems and make them wealthy beyond anything he'd ever imagined. But it also meant their property was now incredibly valuable, which would bring new complications and dangers. Those complications arrived sooner than expected. Jake Burton appeared at their door 3 days after the geologist left, accompanied by 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. All 3 wore guns and carried themselves like men accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation. "Tom, we need to talk," Jake announced, not waiting for an invitation before walking into the house. "I've been hearing interesting stories about oil discoveries and geological surveys." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Margaret. "Any oil on our land is our business, Jake." "See, that's where you're wrong." Jake's companions spread out to block the doorway while he continued talking. "That swampland where you found the oil? It used to be part of my family's original claim back in '78. There's some question about whether the deed transfer was legal." Margaret spoke up from behind Thomas, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. "That's completely false, and you know it. I have all the original documentation going back 15 years. My family purchased that land legally from the territorial government." One of Jake's companions, a large man with scarred hands, laughed harshly. "Paperwork can be disputed, lady, especially when there's this much money involved." Thomas felt his anger rising. "Get out of our house, Jake. All of you. Now, don't be hasty, Tom. I'm here to make you a reasonable offer." Jake pulled out a legal-looking document. "I'm prepared to buy your entire property for twice what you paid for it. That's generous, considering your current financial situation." The answer is no. Jake's expression hardened. "You might want to think about that decision carefully. Oil drilling is dangerous business. Lots of accidents can happen. Fires, explosions, equipment failures. A man could lose everything he's worked for." The threat was clear, but Thomas refused to be intimidated. "I said no. Now, get out." After Jake and his men left, Thomas and Margaret spent a long time discussing their options. They could sell the land and take a profit, avoiding any confrontation with Jake. They could try to develop the oil field themselves, which would require significant investment and expertise they didn't possess. Or they could sell drilling rights to an established oil company while retaining ownership of the land. Margaret favored the third option. "We keep control of our property, but we partner with professionals who know how to extract and sell oil safely and profitably." They contacted 3 different oil companies, and within 2 weeks had received offers from all of them. The terms were better than Thomas had dared hope. The winning company would pay them a substantial upfront fee, plus a percentage of all oil extracted from their land. Even if the oil field proved smaller than expected, they would be financially secure for life. But Jake wasn't finished causing problems. The day before they planned to sign the drilling contract, he filed a legal challenge claiming ownership of the swampland where the oil was discovered. His claim was based on an alleged boundary dispute from nearly a decade earlier, supported by questionable documentation and 2 witnesses who everyone knew Jake had paid for their testimony. The case went before the territorial court in a hearing that became the talk of 3 counties. Jake hired an expensive lawyer from Denver and presented what looked like a convincing case to anyone who didn't examine the evidence closely. Margaret, however, had been preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. She presented the court with a thick folder of documents, original land patents, survey records, tax payment receipts, and detailed geological maps that proved her family's continuous ownership and development of the property. Her documentation was so thorough and well organized that Jake's lawyer began to look uncomfortable as the hearing progressed. The decisive moment came when Margaret presented photographs she had taken during her geological surveys, showing clear evidence that the oil deposit was located entirely within their legally established property boundaries. She had even included measurements and reference points that could be verified by independent surveyors. Judge Morrison ruled in their favor within hours of hearing all the evidence. Jake's claim was dismissed, and he was ordered to pay court costs. More importantly for Thomas and Margaret, the ruling officially confirmed their ownership of the oil-rich land and cleared the way for development. That evening, as oil company representatives arrived to begin site preparation for drilling, Thomas looked at his wife with new respect and something approaching awe. Margaret had not only discovered the oil, but she had protected it with careful preparation and intelligent planning. "How did you know to document everything so carefully?" he asked. Margaret smiled, watching the first oil derrick being assembled in their field. "I told you my father was a geologist. He taught me that land disputes always come down to documentation. The person with the best records wins." The sound of oil derricks working became the rhythm of their new life. Within 6 weeks, 3 pumps were pulling black gold from the earth at a rate that amazed even the experienced drilling crew. The checks from the oil company arrived monthly, each one larger than Thomas had earned in entire years before. But the money wasn't the only thing that had changed. Thomas found himself watching Margaret differently now. Where he had once seen only the physical differences from her photograph, he now saw the woman who had saved his ranch, fought off legal challenges, and transformed worthless swampland into the foundation of a fortune. She moved around their property with confidence, consulting with engineers, reviewing financial reports, and making decisions that affected their growing business empire. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, Thomas finally found the courage to say what had been building in his heart for weeks. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." She looked up from the geological survey she'd been reviewing, her intelligent eyes focusing on his face with that same careful attention she gave to everything important. "I've been thinking about our marriage," Thomas continued, struggling to find the right words. "About why we married and what it's become." Margaret set down her papers completely, giving him her full attention. "What about it, Thomas? When I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought I knew what I wanted. A companion, someone to help with the household, maybe give me children someday. Someone who looked like that photograph." Thomas paused, gathering his courage. "But I was wrong about what I needed." "What did you need?" "You." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "Not someone who looked like you were supposed to look, but exactly who you are. Your intelligence, your strength, your ability to see possibilities where everyone else sees problems. Margaret, I've fallen in love with the woman you actually are, not the woman I thought I was getting." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas feared he'd made a mistake by being so honest. Then she smiled, not the mysterious smile he'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer and more open. "Thomas, can I tell you a secret?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "I fell in love with you before you fell in love with me. I loved you from the moment you chose honor over disappointment at that train station. You could have rejected me, sent me back, claimed I'd deceived you. Instead, you kept your word and treated me with respect, even when you were clearly struggling with the situation." Thomas felt something tight in his chest finally release. "You loved me even when I was sleeping in a separate room and feeling sorry for myself about the photograph. Especially then, because it showed me what kind of man you really are. You were disappointed, but you didn't take it out on me. You were struggling, but you didn't blame me for problems that weren't my fault. That's when I knew I'd chosen the right man. Chosen. Margaret laughed, a sound Thomas realized he'd been hoping to hear more often. Thomas, do you really think I answered your advertisement by accident? I researched you for months before I wrote that first letter. I knew about your ranch, your reputation in the community, your financial situation. I even knew about the geological formations on your land. Thomas stared at her in amazement. You knew about the oil before you came here? I suspected it. My father had done surveys in this area years ago and identified it as promising for petroleum deposits. When I saw your advertisement and researched your property location, I realized you owned land that was potentially very valuable. But more importantly, I learned that you were known as an honest man who treated people fairly, even when he was struggling. The revelation was overwhelming. Thomas had thought he was the one making a calculated decision by marrying for land. Instead, Margaret had been the one with a real plan all along. So you came here knowing you could make us both rich? I came here knowing I could make us both successful. If you turn out to be the man I hoped you were. Margaret reached over and took his hand. The money was never the point, Thomas. I could have developed that oil field with any number of partners. But I wanted a husband, a real marriage, a family. I wanted to build something lasting with a good man. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Thomas kissed his wife. Not as part of a business arrangement, but as a man who had found the love of his life in the most unexpected package. They moved into the same bedroom and began their marriage in earnest. The transformation in their relationship was immediately obvious to everyone around them. Where they had once worked together efficiently, they now worked together joyfully. Margaret's laughter became a regular sound around the ranch. Thomas found himself smiling more than he had in years. Their success had brought them wealth, but their love brought them happiness. The money continued to flow in from the oil wells, but Thomas and Margaret chose to use their wealth thoughtfully. They expanded the irrigation system to help neighboring ranchers who were still struggling with drought conditions. They invested in better breeding stock and modern farming equipment. Most importantly, they began offering jobs to unemployed men from surrounding counties, providing steady wages and helping entire families get back on their feet. Their generosity didn't go unnoticed. The same neighbors who had mocked their unusual marriage now sought their advice and assistance. Margaret became known throughout the territory as a brilliant engineer and businesswoman. Thomas earned respect as a fair employer and community leader. In the spring, Margaret told Thomas she was expecting their first child. The news filled him with joy and a sense of completion he'd never experienced. They were no longer just business partners or even just husband and wife. They were building a family and a legacy. But the most surprising development came when Jake Burton appeared at their door once again. This time, he was alone, and he looked like a broken man. His attempts to claim their oil land had cost him everything. Legal fees, damaged reputation, and lost business opportunities had left him nearly bankrupt. Tom, Margaret, Jake said, hat in hand, I've come to apologize and to ask for help. Thomas looked at Margaret, unsure how to respond to the man who had tried to steal their fortune. Margaret stepped forward with the same calm confidence she brought to every situation. Jake, everyone deserves a second chance to make better choices. What kind of help are you looking for? Work. Honest work. I'll take any job you have available, any wages you think are fair. I need to rebuild my life, and I need to prove I'm better than the man who tried to cheat you. Thomas felt Margaret squeeze his hand, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. Success meant nothing if it didn't include the opportunity to lift others up. Be here Monday morning at dawn, Thomas told Jake. We'll start you as a ranch hand and see how it goes. 5 years later, Thomas stood on the hill overlooking what had once been his failing ranch and could hardly believe the transformation. Oil derricks dotted the landscape like giant mechanical trees, pumping wealth from the earth 24 hours a day. Green pastures stretched to the horizon, fed by the irrigation system that had started it all. A thriving town had grown up around their operation, complete with a school, a church, and dozens of businesses that served the families who worked for them. Margaret appeared beside him, their 3-year-old son Johnny riding on her shoulders while their infant daughter, Sarah, slept in her arms. Despite carrying 2 children, Margaret moved with the same confidence she'd always possessed. Motherhood had only added another dimension to her remarkable capabilities. "Remember when you thought this land was worthless?" Margaret asked, adjusting Johnny's grip on her hair. Thomas laughed, wrapping his arm around his family. "I remember thinking a lot of foolish things back then, mostly about judging people by their appearances instead of their character." Down in the valley, they could see Jake Burton working with a crew of men to extend the irrigation system to newly purchased land. Jake had proven himself over the past 4 years, working his way up from ranch hand to foreman. He'd married a local school teacher and was expecting his first child. The man who had once tried to steal their fortune had become one of their most trusted employees and a close family friend. "Another train coming in today," Margaret observed, pointing toward the small station they'd built to serve their growing community. 3 more families from back east looking for opportunities. Thomas watched the smoke from the approaching locomotive. "Do you ever regret leaving Pennsylvania? Trading city life for all this Western adventure?" Margaret shifted Sarah to her other arm and smiled. "Thomas, I didn't trade anything. I invested everything I had in something I believed would pay enormous dividends." And I was right. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Margaret sat in the parlor of their expanded house, reviewing business reports and planning new projects. Their success had grown beyond the oil wells. They now owned the largest ranch operation in 3 counties, had invested in mining ventures, and were part owners in the railroad line that connected their town to Denver. "I've been thinking about something," Thomas said, setting down the financial statements he'd been reading. "That first day at the train station, when you stepped off with such confidence despite knowing you looked nothing like the photograph. How did you know I wouldn't just send you right back?" Margaret looked up from her correspondence with the expression Thomas had learned meant she was about to reveal something important. "Because I'd researched you thoroughly, remember? I knew you were a man of honor. But there was something else." "What?" Margaret walked to the desk and pulled out a small wooden box Thomas had never seen before. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a photograph. But this wasn't the delicate woman's photograph he'd been sent. This was a picture of Margaret herself, exactly as she'd looked when she stepped off that train. Thomas stared at the photograph in confusion. "I don't understand. This wasn't the picture I received." "No, it wasn't." Margaret sat beside him, holding the real photograph. "The picture you received was of my sister Catherine. She's everything I'm not, slender, conventionally beautiful, the kind of woman men write to when they're looking for mail-order brides." "Your sister? But why would you send her picture instead of your own?" Margaret took a deep breath, and Thomas realized she was about to reveal the biggest secret of all. "Because I needed to know if you were the kind of man who could love a woman for her mind, her character, and her heart instead of just her appearance. Any man can fall in love with a beautiful woman. I needed a man who could fall in love with me." Thomas felt his world shift as he understood the full scope of what Margaret had done. "You mean the photograph deception was intentional? You planned for me to be disappointed? I planned to test your character. If you had rejected me at the train station, sent me back, or treated me poorly because I didn't match your expectations, I would have known you weren't the right man for me." Margaret reached over and took his hand. "But you didn't do any of those things. You honored our agreement, treated me with respect, and gave me a chance to prove my worth. That's when I knew I'd found exactly what I was looking for." Thomas looked at the photograph again, then at his wife. "So everything, the marriage, the oil discovery, our whole life together, was part of some elaborate plan, not a plan for our whole life. A plan to find out if we could have a whole life together." Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thomas, I could have developed that oil field with any business partner. I could have made my fortune working with any number of men. But I didn't want just success. I wanted love, family, partnership with someone who valued me for who I really am. And if I had failed your test, then I would have helped you save your ranch as agreed, taken a fair share of the profits, and moved on to find someone else. But you didn't fail, Thomas. You exceeded every hope I had. Thomas set down the photograph and pulled Margaret into his arms. After 5 years of marriage, she could still surprise him with the depth of her planning and the strength of her faith in his character. So you're telling me that you traveled halfway across the country, carrying geological surveys and a secret plan to test whether a struggling rancher you'd never met could see past appearances to fall in love with your heart. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Thomas laughed, holding his remarkable wife closer. Margaret Hartwell, you are the most extraordinary woman who ever lived. And you, Thomas Hartwell, are exactly the man I hoped you would be. Years later, when their grandchildren asked how they'd built their fortune, Thomas would tell them the whole story. How a desperate rancher had ordered a mail-order bride for her dowry land. How the woman who arrived looked nothing like her photograph, but possessed knowledge that transformed worthless swampland into an oil empire. How love grew from respect, and respect grew from character revealed under pressure. But he always ended the story the same way. The real treasure wasn't the oil we found in the ground or the water that saved our ranch. The real treasure was your grandmother's faith that somewhere in this big country was a man who could love her not for what she looked like, but for who she really was. And children, that's a treasure worth more than all the oil in Colorado. The Hartwell name still graces buildings throughout Colorado today, a testament to what can be built when two people see past appearances to discover the true wealth that lies in character, determination, and love that looks beyond the surface to find the gold that really matters.